Hi, this is Stephen, and thank you again for tuning into my channel. So what I'm going to talk about today is the actual bombs themselves as they went off in Dublin and in Monaghan on that fateful day of the 17th of May 1974. So first of all, there was the bombing in Parnell Street. The bombing in Parnell Street took place just before 5:30 p.m. that day. The second bomb took place on Talbot Street, outside O'Neill's shoe shop. The third bombing then took place outside, just on South Leinster Street in Dublin. And that was then the last bombing that took place in Dublin. All three of these bombs took place within around 90 seconds of one another. Then you had the bombing, of course, in Monaghan. And the bombing in Monaghan took place just before 7 p.m. that day. It took place outside of a pub called Graken's Pub. A total of 34 people were killed and a total of around 300 people were injured in the bombings between Dublin and Monaghan. The youngest was a full-term unborn child, and the oldest was 80-year-old John Dargle from Portland Row in Dublin. There was a huge variation amongst the victims in terms of age, gender, occupational status, and even nationality. Two of the people killed weren't even Irish. You had Antonio Maglocchio, who was Italian, and Simone Chétry, whom I will return to, who was French. So, turning to Simone Chétry, we might as well. Ms. Chétry was a young French student. She was in Ireland in order to improve her English. She stayed with a family, and she actually managed to extend her stay because she loved the place so much. And the day of the bombings was actually due to be her very last day in the country, and little was she to know that it was her last day alive. Her family were refugees from the Holocaust, and when she heard the Parnell Street bomb, which, as we've heard, went off first, her actual initial response was to go in the direction of the bomb with her friend she was with at the time, because, as she said to her friend, she was concerned that people might need their help. So incredibly, her action, rather than fleeing for cover, was to flee in the direction of danger and to try and assist people who had lost their lives or whose lives were at risk. Despite this act of selflessness, she was killed not due to the bomb in which direction she went, the direction of which she went, but rather the bomb on Talbot Street. That was the blast which sadly killed her. So that was the case of Ms. Chétry, quite a poignant case, I think you'll agree. You had another example was Concepta Dempsey. Her niece Gertie Shields noted how Ms. Dempsey had worked in Guiney's department store on Talbot Street. She had been on the second floor with her back to the window when the bomb went off. And in her niece, Ms. Shields' description, she suffered horrific injuries because it seems that some of the piping from outside the building became embedded in her back. She lived for perhaps 9 days on life support but never regained consciousness. My mother, brother, and sister went to the hospital first to visit and identify her, but she never recognized any of them. Another victim was Colette O'Doherty, who was 9 months pregnant. She and her unborn child were killed while she pushed a pram. Her other daughter survived and was found wandering the streets of Dublin barefoot. The O'Brien family. This was a family of 4: John, Anna, Jacqueline, and Anne-Marie, and the entire family of 4 was wiped out. The only picture of the 4 of them together was a picture that was published in the Irish Independent in the aftermath of the bombings, and it was a picture of their 4 coffins. They were pictured in the Pro-Cathedral in Dublin, and the photograph showed the parents' adult coffins being flanked by the small white coffins of the 2 children. Christopher Keane was a person whose testimony showed the psychological damage of being caught up in the bombings, even though this was an individual who only seems to have sustained glancing physical injuries. So it's an example of how the figure for the injured of around 300 does not do justice to all of those who experienced psychological injuries and mental health consequences. Mr. Keane was transported to hospital by bus. There had been a bus strike on that day, but buses were requisitioned and driven as effectively ambulances by public-spirited citizens due to the fact that there simply weren't enough ambulances to cope with the scale of carnage in Dublin on that day. He said, quote, "I remember holding an old lady. They had put her into my arms. Her legs were blown off, and she looked close to death. She looked in my face and murmured, quote, 'I have a son your age,' unquote. And then she slumped sideways and closed her eyes," unquote. So Mr. Keane's mental health difficulties included that he had years of nightmares as a result of what happened, lasting psychological damage that resulted in him having to give up his job, and he even attempted to kill himself as a result of the distress at what had happened and the ongoing psychological consequences. So it's an example, I suppose, of the fact that the injuries were not all physical, but that's just a small set of stories that give a glance into the types of injuries and deaths that were sustained as a result of these bombings. So, as I say, that's just a small set of examples. Thank you very much for tuning in for this episode, and I'll speak to you next time.